I said, my journey has been going from that situation, kind of be like, right, I potentially have adversity to this, but rather than sitting and wallowing in it, be like, right, what can I actually do to overcome this and get to that picture I've got in my head of where I want to be. But like in my head, I wanted to take myself to that extreme. Like, right, I want to see how far I can physically push every place where we kind of, right, which exercises do I enjoy? Which ones are fitted to a certain extent to me? Right, let's get strong as hell at these.
Because I've probably done a variation of GBC 8 times a day, 6 days a week. Whereas that client does it once a week.
Yeah.
And like,
they might be getting into it and be like, "This is great." This, and you're like, "No, we're going to do something else now."
yeah, exactly. I love this program. Well, sorry, week 5. Fuck you. Just quickly before we get into the full show, for any of you who's watched this podcast before, you will know that I am super passionate about this podcast and getting on the most interesting guests to help you get better results with your fat loss, your business, your life, and your coaching skills. But at the moment, 85% of you who watch this channel aren't subscribed to the channel. The bigger the channel gets, the better the guests get, the more high production value the show gets, as well as the clips get. So if you're watching this, please, can you click subscribe, like, comment, improve interaction so YouTube know we are a channel to be reckoned with. And then we can take over, and then I'm coming for you, Joe Rogan. Cool. So, Alex, so I've been looking forward to this one for a little while. In a way, even before the podcast started, I remember a time going back and visiting you when you lived with my good buddy Umar and seeing the unbelievable level of food prep, I think through a massive slow cooker pot. And Umar telling me you had like a year's worth of MyFitnessPal ahead pre-written in your diary. So, as I said off air, I titled this episode, "Are You Really a Hard Gainer?" Because, and you are definitely the perfect person to have on this, because I think you, looking at how you used to look, you are the frame of somebody who people wouldn't expect could gain the amount of muscle in the time frame you have. So before we talk about your journey, do you think there's such a thing as a hard gainer?
No, I think there's such thing as a difficult gainer. And I think certain people are going to gain muscle more easily than others, but no. I think because people see hard gainer as, I can't gain muscle, don't they? It's not kind of this thing, oh, it's going to be difficult, but I'm going to get there eventually. They use hard gainer as an excuse to be like, oh, 2 years down the line, I look exactly the same as I did before because I find it difficult. And that's why I kind of go, nah, you're just kidding yourself. There's either something that you're missing or you put that excuse in your head and you're never going to get there.
So we'll cover the things that people are missing later on in the show. But you mentioned there you think there are difficult gainers. So people find it harder than others. What factors do you think play a role in how easy or how difficult it is to gain muscle from a not the obvious, I'm in control of this kind of way?
Yeah, so I think people don't train very well and people don't eat very well. It's kind of the two simple bits. I think it doesn't necessarily have to be any more complicated than that. I think, because a bit of background for me, so I'm 6'5", and when I was at my kind of smallest, and we'll kind of get into my journey in a sec, I was about 70 kilos, up to 75 kilos. So I was one of those proper, like, if you picture a lamppost outside with arms, that's what I looked like type situation. And I think people who label themselves a hard gainer, they don't understand how to train for their frame, and they don't understand necessarily how to set things up for them, because it's guys who've seen programs online and they've been like, oh, I've seen this person who's put on X amount of muscle, this influencer, this bodybuilder, whatever it might be, I'm going to do exactly what they did. And then that's when they get into that situation, like, oh, I'm not really going anywhere here because I haven't put myself in that situation where I can actually grow. And the second part of that, in terms of the food side of things, I think people just genuinely still don't realize how much they need to eat to be able to do that at the same point. Like you mentioned that joke at the start in terms of, right, you came round and our kitchen was pretty much just full of Tupperwares, and I think our living room was overrun by them as well. I mean, we could never find the flipping lids for them, but we had enough Tupperware there to feed an army for about a week. And it's just finding that situation, similar thing with training, of, right, this is the amount of food that I need to eat, and then actually being able to get that down on a daily basis at the same point as well. So it tends to be those simple bits that people haven't got in place. But then as soon as they do, and they do it for an extended period of time, that's when things can start to come through at the same point.
Do you think if people have those in place, and we're going to dive into those later, but if people have those things in place, can everybody gain muscle?
Yes. Yeah.
Good.
It's going to take some people longer than others. Yeah, exactly. Imagine it was no, and we'd be like, oh, that's
some of you are fucked, but don't worry. For the people that aren't, exactly. Keep listening.
No, I think it's going to take some people longer than others, realistically, and on certain frames, it's going to take longer to see it at the same time too.
Do you think
Like,
that's more of an impact, though? You say that people take longer than others. Do you think that's because there are things like gut issues, hormonal differences, levels of testosterone, like genetic factors? Or do you think that people are actually gaining muscle potentially at the equivalent rate, but someone who is long and 6'8" compared to someone that's 5'5", the amount of muscle you'd have to gain to look big is totally different?
I think yes to both. It is both those things at the same point. Like certain people are going to be in a more advantageous position to be able to grow, but also if you imagine, like say for example, you've got again that person who's 6'8" or someone like me who's 6'5", and you kind of go right 2 kilos on that frame, you're not really going to see it. You're not going to look at that person and be like, oh, they've got a heck of a lot bigger. Like they're not going to see their granny after a year and be like, oh, you've really got a lot bigger. I've got to feed you up this time. But you put that on someone who's 5'2", and you go, oh yeah, I can see that change coming through a little bit further. So I think it comes down to a little bit of both at that same point. So I think, and it's difficult to kind of speak about because I don't want to label myself with that same excuse that I had there at the start. But I just said my journey has been going from that situation, kind of be like, right, I potentially have adversity to this, but rather than sitting and wallowing in it, be like, right, what can I actually do to overcome this and get to that picture I've got in my head of where I want to be?
Do you think somatotypes actually play a big role? Because people say eat for your body type, right? And we always see the obvious mesomorph, endomorph, ectomorph, and I think in the fat loss realm, it's kind of been not completely debunked, but relatively debunked. And with the muscle building game, as much as like as you said here earlier on, that everyone can gain muscle, there is what I like to call it. This is a bit of an inside joke. I call it the Luke McGurk effect, or for people here who know me in Hong Kong, the James Chester effect. You know those people that train infrequently, always look jacked, bit of muscle, and you know they've never struggled. They've never struggled. They're always 95 kilos and lean. So do you think it does make a difference? Like some people are just really genetically gifted.
I think they are. Like you had the Luke McGurk effect. I call them bastards from my end because I'm like these are people
I normally do.
My life.
I call them bastards, but then I really like Luke.
Exactly. So you kind of I can't really link these two bits together. Sorry, I forgot the question. I was busy taking the piss. I think it's you're always going to have people in that situation, aren't you? Like, I think everyone knows. Everyone could probably name someone like you've obviously got Luke and James, where everyone knows someone they can look at a dumbbell and they can just mutate. But realistically, that could be a genetic thing. It could be something else that's happening, but also could be a case of that person is doing more than what you're doing at the moment.
And so either way, you're not in control. And either way, you're never going to be them. So you just have to start acting, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so that's again, it comes back to what I said before. That's where the term hard gainer comes from. Like you Google hard gainer, you look at the number of articles in these different bits, and all these things are almost kind of said negatively, aren't they? Where it's like, oh, you're a hard gainer, you've been trying to build muscle for this period of time, you've been eating this amount for this period of time, but recently people haven't been. They just need to reframe how they think, reframe their actions, or retrain their actions, I should say. And that's when they can suddenly start to put a good bit of tissue on.
So to go into a little bit, tell us about your muscle building journey. Like, how much weight have you actually put on? You mentioned 70 kilos earlier on. Where are you at now?
So I'm now dieting, ironically.
Okay.
But I'm now about 97 kgs in the morning. So my kind of journey, my official journey in terms of the gym started years and years back. So I've been qualified as PT about 11 years now. But I started to take things seriously and started to step things up a little bit 5-6 years ago now. So when I moved to London, joined UP, and at that point I was probably about 80 kgs, but I wasn't like a good 80 kgs. There was body fat there. There wasn't a huge amount of muscle mass underneath, and that period of time in my life was my baptism of fire to start with. Like, right, this is how you need to train. This is how you need to conduct yourself. This is how you need to almost live that life as a trainer, but also live that life as a trainee. So I went through a time where I initially dieted, had to get to a situation where I was leaner, a bit more responsive to what I was actually going to be throwing kind of at my body, and went from, at that point, probably about 76, 77 kilos at my lightest, up to the peak of my kind of extended gaining phase, which ended in about May time this year. I've topped out about 110 kilos. So it's about, just over 32, 33 kilos in terms of total mass put on, which I wish was all muscle. Long time. 3 years, 4 years, probably going up over that. Because I initially, when I first joined UP, I essentially kept a similar body weight for a period of time. Did a photo shoot with Rob, who's obviously been on a guest in here a good few times, and one of the single best blokes you'll ever meet.
Great.
So that was 2018. We did that, and then back in 2018, probably 3.5 years. Went from 78 kilos on photo shoot day to being about 110, 111. So it was a long time, which took a heck of a lot of eating and a heck of a lot of time force feeding, which on paper sounds like the best thing ever, but in practice suddenly gets a hell of a lot less fun.
You mentioned sort of like being like 80 kilos, but not a good 80 kilos when you first joined UP, like carrying a bit of body fat, and you started to pay attention to what you put in your mouth. And then you got up to 110 and you said you wish it was all muscle, but obviously we know that's not the case. We see a lot of people do this, right? So people will often assume that they're eating in a surplus and looking to build muscle because they're getting heavier and they're putting on a little bit of body fat. But we all know the kind of person that gains. You could have got to 110 in two very, very different ways. And both examples you could be training. What's the difference? What's the difference between 110 kilos to the 80 kilos soft?
Yeah. So I think everyone knows someone, don't they, that's done a dirty bulk. They've had that period of time when they've literally been like, right, calories all that matters. I'm going to get everything possible into my mouth. But the way I look at it is, if you're going to gain that excessive amount of weight over a serious period of time, you've actually got to be able to sustain that. And that's where I mentioned before, like people seeing a lot of food as being quite a fun thing and quite a enjoyable thing to do. Because like you talk to, especially someone that's been dieting, for example, you kind of go, well, I mean, I don't know, 4,000 or 5,000 calories, and they go, oh, I wish I could eat that. I wish I could eat a Domino's every single day. I wish I could get this down because I'd physically be able to get that into my numbers. But if you're going to sustain that for years and progressively overeat for years, you can't do it too dirtily at the same point. You've got to actually understand the amount of food that your body needs and how you're going to be able to get it in. So yeah, you could do like I said, I could have done that in a year. I could have probably still trained and got strong as hell, eaten everything in sight, and I would have got up to that amount of weight. But I'd looked like a sack of shit. I'd looked horrendous, and would have felt horrendous. Would have gained nowhere near the muscle that I could have gained, because if I was bloated all the time, lack of energy, generally not in a good spot, I'm not going to train well, and almost going against what I was looking to do in terms of build that muscle in the first place. Whereas the way I did it was finding that balance of enough food coming in, but also being, for certain periods of time, militant in terms of what I was eating, and being like, right, if I can keep quality at a good enough level here and actually get food down me, that allows that to happen for an extended period of time, and that's when muscle is going to look to be built. Because what I see it is, over 3.5 years, if you gain, I don't know, average X amount of kilos of muscle a year, the longer you can then project that for, the more total muscle you're going to build.
Do you think the difference between, say, the dirty bulk and the way you did it, putting aside obviously the fact of like, okay, your training would be detrimental by the fact that you felt as shit and you're bloated and you were tired and all that sort of stuff, do you think the fact that the nutrient quality has actually improved the ability to gain muscle more than body fat? Or do you think the difference is the fact that you had a training stimulus that was hard enough to actually create growth from those extra calories rather than just layering on more pounds of fat?
Probably again both, to be honest. I think because training is always going to be that driver of new muscle, realistically, isn't it? We have to have training in a situation where it's set up progressively for a long period of time, but then also we can do that to the best of our ability. But then if we're not eating enough to be able to allow that to happen, we're also not really going to grow to our maximum potential at the same point. It's like, for example, so now when I'm coaching, I work with some competitors, I work with some kind of like not Gen Pop clients, but guys who are a bit more advanced with things, and training is beyond just a hobby for them, but they're not necessarily going to compete. And the way I describe an off season or a gaining phase for them is you want to try and find this level where the body's able to run at 100% in as many different areas as you can. You want training to be able to run at 100%. You want digestive function at 100%. You want hunger as close to 100% as it can be. You need nutritional quality. You need calories in place. You need sleep in place. And you can only really do that if you're eating well. So you can't just disregard that at the same point and be like, no, it's fine, bro. I'm training hard. I've eaten 3 pizzas for lunch pre-workout, but I'm training hard and I'm going to be able to get there. So it's all about this balancing out with both these two things at the same point.
And it's the thing people forget is recovery, right? You know, I listened to a podcast, Diver CEO podcast today with the owner of Whoop, and he was talking about HRV, something that I've spoken about quite a lot on this podcast. But the nutrient deficiencies are going to lower your HRV and lower your ability to recover. Poor sleep, inflammation, gut issues, anything that stresses the system out is going to affect this, which, you might be getting the food in, but if you're not on creating the stimulus, but if you're not recovering from that stimulus, you're not growing because the training is actually making you weaker.
Yes. Yeah. It's just, you're just pounding yourself into the ground and not able to do anything about it. And at the end of the day. So
going back to your journey, what we always talk when it comes to fat loss, we always talk about having a why. It's really important having a why. This is the reason why when I'm tired, I still go and do my steps, right? But with building muscle, it's a much longer process. So what was your why? Why is it that you wanted to get bigger? Like, you could be 85 kilos and lean and be pretty big. Why do you want to be particularly big.
Yeah, I think that's again where this is interesting over a longer period of time, because you don't necessarily just have one for that whole 3.5 years. You don't just have one why that underpins everything that you're looking to do. Whereas if you're dieting for 12 weeks, all you need is one big thing. Oh, that's my purpose here. Okay, I can do that, and that's gonna be able to guide me through. So my initial one came with, we both of us used to work at UP. I was obviously Mayfair, you were at City, and when I first started, typical that people would do a photo shoot when they first joined. So you could prove to everyone that you can go through that transformation, you can go through that dieting process, and even just to understand yourself as a trainer. Right, I'm going to walk the walk. This is what a client is going to be going through. Okay, I'm going to do that myself so I can relate to them and they can relate to me. Whereas when I joined, there were a few juniors that came on board at the same time. I think there were maybe about 5 or 6 of us who all started within about 3 months of each other. And we had a team meeting on a Wednesday. The big boss had flown over and he'd come in, and he made a comment that with the new guys who were coming in, Sean had said we were dieting, and he was like, actually, I think it'd be more impressive if I saw these guys get bigger. Like, I'm not going to name any names. Looked over. I'm not going to name any names, but I think it's actually going to be significantly more impressive if these guys get bigger, because if you're, I think it was something along the lines of, if you're 6 foot or above and 80 kilos or below, you haven't got enough muscle to diet. That sort of situation. So that was my first bit where I was like, oh, okay, I want to do something about this now. Like, this is a company that I've essentially worshipped and fangirled for an extended period of time. Like, I want to prove myself here. So I'm gonna like make myself proud, have the boys look at me and be like, oh no, I respect this guy now, because he's following what this person is saying, and he's showing again he can walk that walk, but in a different setting. So that probably got me maybe my first 6 months, and that got my, like, initially moving with things, but like, right, I need to take this more seriously now. I need to take my own training more seriously. I need to be more consistent with everything that I'm doing. I need to understand more about what I need to be able to grow. And that then got me to a situation where, right, that kind of initial foundation has been built. Then I had to do a photo shoot in the end. So that's when me and Rob did our shoot together. And then after that, it was kind of like my second step. So that was when I was actually at my lightest. So I'd initially recomped a decent amount, like put on a little bit of tissue, dieted down, realized I didn't have any tissue. And then I was like, right, I need to get bigger again. I've been exposed to how little muscle I've got. It's time to put some more underneath that. So the next time I come around to this, I can show off a lot more. I think,
sorry to cut you off there, but I think that's a really important thing I don't want you to gloss over, is because from a dieting perspective, you see this with clients all the time, right? Where guys don't want to go below a certain number. If I go below 70, I feel small. And you end up with these people in this limbo state where they're not lean enough to finish the diet, right? But they're still a bit too fat to really put the calories in, because it's going to be a short bulking season because they just hit 25-30% within the first 3-4 weeks. And they just never ever move from there. And sometimes it's like that tough love of like, yeah, do you know what? The first diet is just finding out how much muscle you have. And let's face it, it's going to be less than you think. And that is going to be a hard pill to swallow. But the only way to get there is to see what it is and then look at improving on that. You know, you're a great example of this. Kevin Hoare, who I mentor, who's now put on tons of muscle. His first shoot, he wasn't happy with. But look at him now. And it's because he got there and had a baseline.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And I think it's also interesting as well, because they're the periods of time that you look back on, and because you've got a different reference point X amount of years down the line, you go, oh, I was tiny at that point. Whereas for me at that stage, I was like, oh, I'm pretty small here. I want to get bigger, but I'm not looking at myself like, oh, I hate how I look. I hate this, which I think was also quite an important bit. So it wasn't then a journey driven by, oh, I need to not look shit. It's a journey of, oh, I want to look better. So then after that, I inevitably was going to go into an extended period of time gaining, because I didn't have to diet down for anything. I'd kind of tick the photo shoot box at UP. I was like, right, let's go into kind of push things up from here. I was also interesting at that point, struggling with a few stomach issues post-shoot. Because the first time I dieted down to that extreme, I was like, right, I want to eat everything in the building here. And it's difficult doing that. I remember making oats and putting Skittles in them because I had carbs left, and being like, oh, I'll just put a few in here. I'll put the whole thing in there. There was a little garage around the corner from Mayfair. I don't know if you can picture it, Stuff Park Lane. And we used to go there and we kind of like get monsters and get snacks and stuff like that. And I used to go in there every day, and I think they had a box of oats, and I could obviously get sachets. I can't remember how many you used, but I'd buy a bag of Skittles and put them in there. And they're eating them at the desk and be like, oh, it's great. I've got carbs going in here. Everyone's going to love this. I look back at now and I was like, what was I doing? Like, just being in that situation where it's justifying things. And I was like, oh, no, I've got to eat them.
I'm terrible for that. I'm brilliant at walking past, like in a routine. If I walk from work a certain way, I'll find a shop and I'll buy stuff because I passed that shop. It just becomes part of my route home. I remember when I lived in Maida Vale, and there was these like 2 Crest bars for $5, right, at this shop around the corner. And it's obviously slightly better than necessarily Skittles. But of course I had to buy like 6 bars. Standard, right? Because where else do you get that deal? But that deal wasn't going anywhere. I was doing it every day, passing an M&S and getting a bag of Cookie Bites because I like Cookie Bites, and there's an M&S in Liverpool Street that sells them. And it just became that's my routine. It's my walk to work. And I actually had to change my route home on multiple occasions to get, it got me some extra steps and just got me out of that routine of I buy that thing on autopilot.
Yeah. Also, they were the days when we all thought Quest bars were nice. When you have
so hard and chewy.
Like eating. Jesus, you put it in the microwave, it comes out even tougher. It fills you up though, because it takes about half an hour to eat each one.
And your teeth hurt, so you don't want to eat anything else afterwards. You know, like I even protein bars in general. When you start looking at like, I remember going to Body Power and it was like all about protein bars and pre-workout, and then you actually start to actually understand calories a little bit, and you go, do you know what? I'm just going to have a Galaxy.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, like, and then have a protein shake next to it. Ridiculous.
I think the only thing that's getting big is your jaw. Like, have you seen what's that guy? Is it Giga Chad? You know that dude with the ball gag jawline ever.
I thought you meant like the ball gag. You seen that thing where the people have that little ball gag they bite onto to improve their jaw muscles?
Oh yeah, I thought you were like a gimp mask for a second. I was like, you're talking to Rob too much.
It pretty much is. And well, yes, I have had that discussion with him.
What was my intention? Oh yeah, but I was sorry to go back to. I was putting Skittles in my. I was having a few digestive problems because I was essentially eating everything under the sun. I was like, actually, I'm at a stage now where I need a little bit more help with this. So that's when I first reached out to Cal. That was 2018, kind of end of that year. And I was like, right, I want to start to learn more about this now. I've seen this guy online who's obviously very, very good at what he does. I think he was still at M10 at that point, so he was kind of starting to really develop as a coach. I was like, right, this is now going to be kind of the person that guides me on the next step of my journey. So it went from being, right, the first stage is making me prouder to work at UP and having the boys, I said, look at me kind of through a different lens. I'm like, right, this guy is doing the right things. But like, actually, I've now got a coach and I've got to follow him. And I want to emulate this guy because this guy in my head was X amount of years ahead of me in his career. Right, that's what I'm going to start to chase now. So that's when things started to kind of get a little bit more serious. And that probably was my next year of doing things, kind of under his wing. And that's when things really started to crank up. And that's when, almost like laughable, I look back at that now, because that's when you come around to our flat. And the guys I was close to, UP, used to take the mick out of me, like obviously in a good way, like being like, I remember bringing ground rice into work in like 4 different Tupperwares for every single meal. And each meal would be like meat, rice, ground rice. Sorry, meat, veg, ground rice. That was all I really ate. Which I kind of look back on now and I'm like, how the hell did I actually manage to do that? But it was also quite a useful thing to be able to go through, to like actually just to throw myself into that completely for such a long period of time was my foundation in terms of building that first bit of muscle. And it's one of those ones where you learn a heck of a lot by doing that. And I learned a heck of a lot by just going into that situation. Like being like asleep at 9 o'clock every single night, getting up and making sure certain things ticked every single day, and just not leaving myself in a situation where things weren't done.
I think that's a really important thing, right? Because you see a lot of people, and this is the same thing with dieting, right? I always look at like, I don't wholeheartedly believe the phrase, how you do one thing is how you do everything. But I've seen it with clients before where they're adamant that they're weighing everything, they're perfect with the diet, they're absolutely nailing it. And then I'm going, you've been late to the last 8 sessions. And I gave you a workout to do at home and you haven't opened the spreadsheet. And, your life seems a bit chaotic. And I'm like, I don't believe that this diet that you didn't care about 3 weeks ago is now the only thing in your life that you have this attention to detail with. And I think this is the thing I see with a lot of people, is that people leave too much up for chance. They get to the end of the day and they go, hope I've hit my calories today, rather than planning the night before going, this is how I'm hitting my calories today. Or looking back and going, hey, do you realize your steps were at 3,000? Like, why does that happen? It happened because you weren't on top of this. You were kind of just hoping things worked out for the best.
Yeah, it's true. And yeah, that's one of my favorite sayings as well. There are a couple of obviously different situations that will sometimes laugh with, sometimes that won't. But I also found that year was incredibly like insightful in terms of framing. It's going to almost sound a little bit deep, but almost like frame my life, because I was like, well, I'm going to start to take this job seriously now. Like in that situation, I was relatively recently out of a relationship as well. And I was like, right, I've got this period of time I can focus on me. Like I'm just going to focus on that and just go completely hell for leather for as long as I can do, and potentially miss out on certain bits. Like for example, I lived in London for 2.5 years, and people will ask me like, oh, like what do you think of London? What do you think of this? I was like, I didn't really see any of it. Like I wasn't like going out on the weekends and like going to different restaurants, like going out and getting hammered every week. Because at that period of time, I was like, I didn't want to. I was like, actually, I'm going to use this as almost like not a training camp, but kind of that sort of similar situation. I'm going to be like, right, I'm going to get my head down and crack on with what I want to do in my life, because then other things will start to follow in future years. So I had that year, which was 2018, 2019, where I probably put on about 15 kilos of body weight. And again, it wasn't necessarily all muscle. I was natural at that point. It's probably worth saying as well. So it definitely wasn't all muscle. But as it laid that foundation of, I got flipping strong at a hell of a lot of big lifts. I understood what it took to be able to eat that amount of food down. I put on a good amount of tissue, even though it wasn't 15 kilos of pure muscle, to then allow me to be like, right, as I start to push things further up from here, it's now doing it from a much higher situation. And rather than taking 3 years to do that, I could do it in about 12 months.
One of the big things you mentioned there was commitment, right? Like there's an insane level of commitment here, which, as we mentioned, it may be something that a lot of people aren't willing to do. And it is at an extreme level of commitment compared to, you might not have even needed to go that level. Why is it you think you committed to that level to try and get this one? And two, what is it you think made you truly commit to this journey?
Yeah, so I think the first part of that is that I just wanted to, which sounds really weak, but like in my head, I wanted to take myself to that extreme. And be like, right, I want to see how far I can physically push every avenue. And that's not just like I want to see how far I can push myself on the pendulum. It's like, how long can I sustain something that is unsustainable for, and then reap the rewards for it? Like, for example, so I always find in certain situations, the more adversity there is, the more it gets me up for it, the more it gets me going and be like, oh yeah, like I'm now excited for this. Like we spoke obviously before we went on air, like what gets up in the mornings. If I'm faced with something that next day that's difficult and it's going to challenge me and is this thing that almost people are going to look at and be like, oh, we can't do that. Great. That's what gets me up. Like a similar thing. So like, for example, I said I'm dieting now. I've got a photo shoot that's going to be coming up at some point in the next few months. And it's looking like it's more than likely going to be in January at the minute. Because just a couple of reasons that will kind of come out of the next few months. But it's more likely to be kind of January, February time. And that goes with, but then I'm going to be dieting over Christmas. But then also in my head, I'm like, great. Like people normally hate dieting over Christmas. People see that as being the hardest thing to do because there are social occasions. There's Christmas Day itself. There's so many bits going on. Whereas I'm like, no, if other people can't do this, I'm going to try and do it myself. Kind of push myself to that level.
I also think when it comes to things like dieting over Christmas, you see it, and again, this is more of a, I don't know, this is probably actually an off-season thing more than a diet. I hate using the term off-season for most people that aren't competing. I don't have an on-season to have an off-season. Yeah, I need to have an on-season. But when like you see it where clients finish dieting, and maybe they're good for a couple of months, and then they'll start to drop off those habits. And I think sometimes it's like, when you haven't got the urgent deadline, when you haven't got a bit of a hard time, it's easy to diet when you have the perfect run, when you can be the all-in or all-out mentality. But when all of a sudden work gets busy, Christmas happens, there's a holiday in the diary. Like at some point, you've got to learn how to manage those things. And to learn how to manage things, that means you've probably got to kind of suck it up and do it more than is necessary for at least one Christmas. If you nail a diet over Christmas one year, you know where the middle ground is the following year. And that is very difficult to do if you just kind of, if every time Christmas comes around, well, I'm going to gain 5 kilos. Every time a holiday comes around, well, the diet's off. Work gets busy. I'll pick the diet back up again when work quiets down, because there'll always be something.
Yeah. There'll always be a potential excuse there. But I think that's where it originally came from, because I said I wanted to be in that situation where it was almost, I said, this thing that other people couldn't do, because that excited me. Like, and I'd happily let people at work take the piss out of me. And like, what was it? I can't remember. We used to take the mick out of something, and it was like, do you remember on Twitter there'd be like Tinder nightmares, and people would have like screenshots of things that had happened. And me and the boys used to joke about this stuff and be like, oh, I was going to go for dinner, but I couldn't because it was 8 p.m. and I had to put my blue light blocking glasses on, and all this extra stuff, and all these extra bits. And the boys used to tear into me, but I was like, I don't mind that, because this is my reason behind doing this. If it was easy, for example, then I probably wouldn't do it.
Well, that's the thing.
So I think that's where mine came from.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? Like, if it was easy to build muscle, if it was easy to get lean, it wouldn't be appealing. Fame, money, and millionaires is an appealing prospect because it's hard to achieve.
Yeah, 100%.
And by the way, for future reference, these are blue light blocking glasses, and they don't look like Cyclops.
Oh, superb! It's the perk of it being 1 p.m. over here compared to with you.
Yeah.
But I also think it's interesting with that as well, because to a certain extent, you can influence that with someone in terms of whether or not they seek out those opportunities for hardship. But I think a lot of the time it just comes down to the individual and how they're wired.
Hmm.
And it's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. Like, I'm sure there are a hell of a lot of things that I've missed out on over the last few years from being wired that way, but there's also a heck of a lot of things I've been able to do because of it.
Hmm. How important do you think your support systems are around you when it comes to, everyone talks about fat loss and how that's important, but especially for a long-term goal like building muscle, like you mentioned, boss man coming in and saying that you need to build muscle. You mentioned looking up to Cal. You've mentioned now working with more advanced guys. Like, do you think you would have been able to commit to the level you have if you didn't have those external influences?
I think certain ones, yes. So another thing that kind of fits into that same mentality is I'm very independent with certain things. I like having my own space with things. So there's never that reliance on other people being around me. But at the same time, if you have the right people around you, they're always going to make you better. So in the UP days, for example, like Rob and I trained together for probably about a year until I left. And I don't think there would have been more than about 3 days where we didn't get a session in, two of us. And then he was incredible in that situation because I had my programming from Cal. It always seemed to be that our diaries would line up and he'd just jump in. And so he almost like sacrificed himself for a year to like, actually, I'll do your session today. I'll kind of jump along for the ride here and go with that. So again, I realize I'm kind of answering both to every question you're putting at me here, but I think it is that little bit of both at the same point. If you have the right people there, they're always going to make things better. But I think also reliance on having the right support network around you can sometimes drag you back at the same point too. It has to be something that's in your own head that other people can then bring out even further.
Yeah, I think as well. There's a pro and a con to support networks. People always look at the positives of a good support network, but there's also a pro of a bad support network, and there's also cons of a good support network. Sometimes the best people in your life, enable you to rest on your laurels, get complacent.
Yeah,
and sometimes a bad support network can push you. I have been in environments that have motivated me and driven me, and I've been in environments that I've hated that have pushed me, and I've been in environments I've hated that have made me not do anything and not act. And I can't always put my finger on what the difference is. But I think that internal drive is probably the big thing. So I think one of the things, you've kind of answered this in terms of yourself, so I'm going to rephrase this next question. But we've kind of touched on that. One of the biggest things I see people struggle on, and myself included a lot of time when it comes to building muscle, is that a diet has an end date. It's very easy to have a commit to 8, 10, 12 weeks when it's like, it's just 3 months of my life. I have an end date. There is a sense of urgency. But when it comes to building muscle, you're looking at 12, 18, 24 months and of time where you've got to commit to it. You're also thinking as well, when you're dieting, you're seeing yourself looking better every single week, every single month. And actually, I compare building muscle to like putting money into an index fund. Dieting is like putting money into savings, right? You see your savings go up. You go, I'm getting richer every single month. But when you put money into an index fund, your bank account looks poorer. You feel broke, but it's working in the background to when you cash it out in 3-4 years, you're rich. So that's a much harder thing to keep motivated with when you're covering up all of your work. So how you mentioned the different whys for you, but whether it's like things that helped you stay consistent over that long-term goal, or what would you advise somebody, if there's nothing else to add for your journey, what would you advise somebody who's going through this period of time and just struggles to commit to something that is so far away it just seems out of reach? It's no urgency.
Yeah, awesome question. So I think for me it was always an enjoyment of what I was doing, because as you said, it's not something that you're getting gratification for that regularly. The gratification you're getting is more than likely going to be, I'm getting stronger at this lift, which for a lot of people is not going to be anywhere near enough. Like for me, it got to a situation where if I added 5 kilos to my rack pull week by week, like that was huge. And I was like, right, I'm so heavily into this now that has made my day and that's made my week. And I was like, right, perfect. I'm going to then do everything possible to allow myself to have that each time. But then as I said, some people haven't necessarily got that. So they've got to try and find that in other avenues. And if you look at it as, again, say if someone's kind of gone, right, the physique that I need, the muscle that I need is 12 months down the line. So I've got to do this for 12 months. And they get to their first weeks and they're actually hating it. Like, it's not going to happen. No chance. They're always going to fight back against it. So they've got to find certain avenues within that either stimulate them or that they like doing. And it's a case of it. There are some people from a mental standpoint when it comes to training, maybe they've got to have changes a heck of a lot of the time. They might need a case of almost like that shiny object every single month, where kind of like the bigger picture is still getting them to where they want to be, but it's not just a case of, right, this is my one path that I'm going to follow. It changes a little bit more around to get them there. Whereas other people on the flip side might be a case they have the same program for a year, they follow it, and then they're all set from there. But if that baseline level of enjoyment isn't apparent from the outset, it's not going to happen. So you've got to find ways of being able to do that. And I said the training is like an easy example to look into, but nutrition is the same thing. You've got to be eating foods that you like. You've got to have your nutrition set up in a way that you actually enjoy and getting it down. And then what ends up happening is if you can get these things in place, you get to a situation where you're 6 months down the line, and because you've almost kind of dived so deeply into this and be like, oh, this is great, I do this every single week, and I do this every single week, and it just builds up from there. You've got a heck of a lot further down the line than you actually realized, rather than being like, oh, I'm waiting for a situation where I'm going to look at myself and I'm going to be happy with how big I am, because that's not going to happen. Take it from me. I'm still looking at myself now and be like, I need to be something bigger. It's always going to be there. But if you're actually like, no, these little things are making me get to that point, you're more than likely going to get closer to it, at least.
The only time you ever feel big is after your first ever weight training session, and then you're literally forever small, aren't you? You always compare it to the next day. And like I think I was extra fucked because when I walked into UP City, I was the first person I met was Justin Maguire.
Oh, right,
and like,
he was 135 and lean.
Yeah, absolute monster. And I was like, right now, if that's what I'm working with, and I'm never getting there, I'm screwed. But you mentioned there about training being this thing, and I think that's one of the big things I've transitioned in my coaching practice now, is that literally I've just spent a lot of money changing my check-in system. So I had a type form question that was the same every single week, and then I realized that it was great for dieting, but it's like the questions are different when someone's building muscle. Like, what was important isn't as important anymore, and I can see people just getting bored and tuning out. So now I have like logic jumps, and like if you're in a building phase, ask you more questions about training, and it becomes the focus and that sort of stuff. And a lot of what I talk about now becomes more training focused, and I try and get them geared up and excited for that. And you mentioned at the start about learning to train for you. And this is something really interesting because I think this is something that's held me back for a very, very long time. You might teach you something here. Being, how tall are you again?
6'5". So
6'5". So you're...
you see that doorway behind me? I'm the height of a door.
Yeah.
That's probably the easiest way of describing it. Yeah.
You're long. I'm not as tall as you. I'm just under 6 foot. But again, I'm long-femored, structurally not particularly great for that. And one of the things I always found for a very, very long time, less so now, is that you got to a point where probably the most I've ever enjoyed training was before I learned anything about exercise mechanics.
Yeah.
Because when I learned exercise mechanics, I realized how shit I was at everything. And then that the ability to be consistent when you get into a squat and go, I feel more like a failure than I am actually excited to do this. So what did you change in your training to make you feel accomplished enough to keep pushing? What did you do in the gym to find how to train for you?
Also, I love that thing on mechanics. I'm the exact same. you open your eyes to be like, I miss the days of being ignorant and just going there and throwing some weight around. But I think, so I was in a situation where when I really started to take things seriously, I'd never really tracked my training to that level of detail before. So one of the things that got me going, and I was kind of quite novel to me, but also quite exciting for me, was actually being able to see changes week by week to my logbook, which is kind of a bit of a bro principle, but being able to be like, right, okay, this is what I've done before, this is now what I'm doing this week. This is now what is building up week by week from there. So the way I went about things, and Cal was a huge part of this, because he was the kind of guy that set this up for me from the outset as well, and was able to put this stuff in place where we kind of, right, which exercises do I enjoy? Which ones are fitted to a certain extent to me? Right, let's get strong as hell at these and blend that mixture of mechanics alongside actual training at the same point. So not getting stuck down a rabbit hole of being like, oh, this has to be absolutely perfect, and if I don't know, move my spine a millimeter out of position, then it's going to be wrong and I've got to stop. But be like, right, we can set this up and then start to really have some fun with it, and things can go from there. So that's how I went about things.
So when it comes to, if someone doesn't know anything about this, and again, this could go down a whole rabbit hole of a conversation that could last for hours, but what are the big things when someone starts looking at their frame and they go, nothing feels right? What are the things that you've seen with clients and yourself and people that you think, right, here's where I would start looking at this. Here's the stuff that maybe you should think about when putting together your building program.
So to a certain extent, to begin with, it's experimentation. Because I think, as you mentioned, that rabbit hole, you can get a little bit lost in terms of, you mentioned somatotypes at the start. Okay, this person has this frame, this approach is more than likely the best thing for them, but it may not be. Like you say, kind of like I could have understand, but like, if someone is very tall and they're very long limbed, get on a machine. A machine, you're going to get more from than using a barbell, or you're going to get more from using dumbbells. And I think you have to find that place where you try a few different approaches. You try almost a few different ways to work a particular muscle, and then you find the one that resonates with you best from there, which is difficult when you're first new into things because everything's going to start to feel pretty similar. But it's finding that spot. Like, for example, if you line up chest movements, you've got a dumbbell press, you've got a barbell press, you've got a machine cable fly, you've got a cuffed cable fly, you've got a cable press, you've got a normal machine press. You put all these different bits together. To start with, have a go on them all. And you kind of go, right, which one am I able to move most effectively with? Which one can I actually feel in the target muscle the most? And then more than likely, things are going to start to build themselves from there. And that's like my kind of practical approach to coaching is normally down that route. It's kind of understanding the fundamentals of, okay, this is more than likely going to be what this person needs, but it actually has to be put into practice at the same point. So it doesn't fall down into that situation, like I said before, of, every tall person needs to use a machine because dumbbells are unstable, which is almost quite an easy soundbite to get lost into.
I think the sound bites are good to give you a systems way of thinking, right? Like someone is longer. Well, I can sit there and go, right, this person's probably going to work well with a hack squat. Now, on the flip side of that, though, we've all seen that person who's 6'5", who is tall and long, but maybe their tib fib is slightly longer than the female, and they have this perfectly upright squat. Or even for the untrained eye, we haven't got an X-ray. They could have the world's deepest hip socket, and they don't move at all. So I see a lot of people. I think when it comes to mechanics, and I had a conversation with this with my mate Steve on the podcast the other week, I think there are 2 times the mechanics wormholes you can go down. They are the muscle mechanics crowd, which is where we've probably gone down a little bit too much sometimes, which is the bands and the data chains and the optimizing profiles. And then there's the structural mechanics crowd, where it's anterior pelvic tilts and diaphragm and ribcage mechanics and gait and all this sort of stuff. And you sort of see kind of people kind of get lost in those things and think, try and be physios or try and optimize things and go, do you know what? That kyphosis might be their structure. They could have broken their ankle 6 times and have a bone spur. Just find out, like you said, experimentation. I love that, because find out what allows them to train hard, safely, effectively, within range of their own. And if it gets better over time, fantastic, but at least you're not wasting time if it doesn't.
Exactly. And again, that will normally fit in with the enjoyment side of things as well, which again is underpinning most of this stuff. Where if you compare, say, a barbell squat and a hack squat, and you've got someone where they kind of go, well, I need them to do some kind of squat pattern for the next year. And for whatever reason, like, again, that tall frame is quite an easy example. Arguably, it's going to be better suited to a hack compared to a barbell squat because it's typically going to be a bit easier for them to fold into. Okay, hack on paper is going to be a better approach, but they love barbell squatting. And they love that challenge where they're kind of like, right, I can get into this and I can get after it. This is my one lift that stimulates me and motivates me like nothing else does. I'm not going to then sit there and be like, no, that's wrong for you. Unless it's dangerous and they're going to snap something. There's no point kind of like, actually, no, veer away from that and go on to this. If they then spend that whole time being like, no, on the hack, looking at the rack, being like, I wish I was over there. Because they can get bored.
Do you think the mechanics... Well, that's the thing. Based off the boredom thing, do you think sometimes the muscle mechanics crowd has almost made it harder to enjoy training unless you're really, really into it? Because I want to, talking about, let's say, the compound lift. I think compound lifts now have almost been demonized in the way machines used to be. In terms of, you can't take them safely to failure. They're not as optimized, blah, 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 blah. But sometimes I look at, we spoke about this, about we need to do this building process for a year and a half, 2 years, 3 years, potentially, right? You need something you can do for the long haul. And don't get me wrong, it's a fairly high ceiling of how many plates you can stick on a hack or a pendulum squat, right? But there's the thing that no one considers about compound lifts. I have an almost infinite ability to load it. I have a skill component that I can get better at. So even if the physique goal is too far away for me to get excited about, perfecting my squat, controlling my feet, controlling where my knees go, and perfecting my brace, sometimes, even if it's not quote-unquote optimal, keeps me in the game longevity long-term. And people get these soundbites like, well, it's not good for building quads. Well, maybe you just, if you've got a hip dominant squat, add a hack squat into the B series. If you've got a quad dominant squat, add more hip thrust into the B series. I think people get very isolated and every exercise should be perfect, rather than thinking, where does this fit in with the larger scope of the entire program?
Completely. I think also the muscle mechanics crowd can also sometimes be the optimal crowd. And chasing optimal in something that's potentially never going to be optimal, but getting so lost in the intricacies of it, being like, oh, well, I've got to try and do this and I've got to try and do that. They forget why they're there in the first place. And I think I've been guilty of doing that 100%. I remember doing RTS for the first time, being like, oh, well, this is the perfect way to set this up. This is the perfect path of motion. This is the perfect elbow position on the press. This is the perfect this. If it's not that, it's wrong. But then as you start to learn more, and I know I was in this situation, you start to learn more, you kind of go, well, that's still going to be incredibly important. Like, you can't disregard certain aspects of training. You can't disregard exercise setup. You can't disregard safety. You can't disregard technique and execution, all these different bits. But you also can't be so obsessive about them that you're not training at the same time. Because people don't like that.
I also think as well, like when it comes to some of these things, if you've got a complicated, if your exercise looks more like a sex swing than the exercise is intended, right? You've probably gone a bit too far. It could be perfect. Like, I remember, and I'm generally, this isn't a criticism here, because this is something he did in his own training, and this guy is one of the greatest coaches I've ever met, Reed Stafford. Right?
Yes.
Reed is an amazing coach, by the way. Shout out to Reed. I think he's still at Kensington. Great coach. But I remember when he turned a leg curl into the perfect seated row with bands and day change. He put a bench behind it, and he had it so it was at the top of the leg curl where it was starting to drop off, and then he pulled it down. Right? And it was amazing. And don't get me wrong, that's him in his own training, and he's wired that way, and he loves it. But if he gave that to an online client, for example, going, this is the perfect way to set things up, he wouldn't want to do it. And in the same way, like, how often, one of the things I think people don't even consider sometimes, especially with intermediate to advanced trainees, if there's an exercise that I skip more than any other in my program, it's the 45-degree leg press. Why? Because it's more effort putting the plate on and off the machine than it is doing the set. So I just don't bother half the time. And that's terrible. But you don't think about it. It's like, okay, how easy is it to get on? If I would rather have a banded version have the most optimal lat profile, or do I just do a pull down and a row?
Yeah. And you've killed two birds with one stone. And this is our first big tangent of the day. But I think this is why, in my opinion, every person who coaches online has to coach on the gym floor. Because we've learned this stuff by training clients in person. Like, we've both been doing it for years and years. We've both been doing it in a very similar environment where you've got pressure on for time, where you've got pressure on to balance. I've got to get a certain amount of work into this person, but I've got a deadline in terms of they've only got 55 minutes, whatever it might be. And if you spend half an hour cocking about on cables, trying to set up the perfect tricep challenge, you've missed the trick. So you kind of almost learn this different way of thinking. Like, I almost in the past would have been scared to answer what I said before in terms of that experimentation side, because it's almost not the educated answer, is it? When you first learn this stuff, you kind of go, oh, the educated answer would be, I'm going to use a machine, I'm going to do this. Whereas actually, when you put that stuff into practice, it more than likely is. It's that, right, let's try it, see what happens, see what the person likes, see what they enjoy, and then you're going to find the best approach.
And like, as well, there's such a blend between theory and practice. I saw a quote, I think it was on the Muscle Nerds Facebook group the other day. It's like, if you're a nerd, lift. If you're jacked, read. A jacked nerd is unstoppable. And there's this thing where it's like, you get so many people are lifting like 1 kilo dumbbells perfectly, and you got so many people bouncing 50 kilo dumbbells terribly. And I'm like, there is a middle ground here. And the people that, some of the biggest lessons I've learned from coaching one-to-one is physically seeing failure. When does reps start to slow down? What happens when people fail? How do I correct that? How do I push past that? You know, and you don't learn that from online, or you don't learn how to manage a busy gym. Not clients in a pure gym online, and you give them this program they just can't do, supersetting things in different floors. Because I've been very guilty.
And it's one of the things I ask people now, like when we're running through the initial programming, it's like, right, have we got the ability to superset things or pair things? If we have, then okay, we could potentially take advantage of it. But if we haven't, I'm not going to get you to trek, like you said, upstairs to get to this other machine, because it's completely redundant doing that, because it's not going to work in a real life setting.
Yes.
And it's also, it's other little things. It's, as you said before, when someone's reaching failure, okay, what are you going to say to them? How are you going to cue them? And all these different bits. And if you've got a client in front of you and you haven't understood what to tell them to do what you want them to do. So for example, I don't know, you're thinking about execution through a pendulum. You're thinking, right, for this person, they need to do these 3 things, and I'm going to get across to them exactly what they are. You haven't got a chance in a paragraph to write down what to tell them, because you don't actually understand it yourself. You're just kind of being like, you're just putting generic notes, and you're just saying, hold the handle, which isn't going to help them. But if you've actually seen it and you've done it multiple times with multiple different people, you're kind of like, okay, this is now what I'm confidently going to write for that person, because what they need.
And working with people firsthand as well, knowing that you have to have multiple different ways to say the same message. If you keep that in the gym environment, look at the RDL, right? If I lose someone loses upper back tension on RDL, I have protect your armpits, biceps to the front of the room, bend the bar, pretend someone's tickling you, hold your credit cards underneath your armpit. There's several different things. Drive your hips forward, fuck the bar. There's so many different ways to say the same thing. And the only reason I know so many of them is because I've had to go, that person understand that. I've got to say this another way.
Yeah. And it sounds ridiculous sometimes. You shout this stuff on a busy gym floor and you're like a proper knobhead here because I've just shouted this really random thing to this person. Maybe it works. Who cares?
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to sort of like your view now of like almost doing what every trainer goes to, down all the wormholes of the mechanic stuff and sort of coming out the other side here, and obviously proving you know what you're talking about with the amount of muscle you put on, like what place do you think daisy chains, reverse bands, banded, all these sort of adjustments, magnets, seat belts, what place do they have now in your training?
In my own training or within coaching?
Both.
So within my own training, I have a small amount of them in there now. But again, this is the real life setting. So I live in the North of England. I live in York. I train at Ultraflex in York, and I have a training partner who is someone that I PT'd 5 years ago, PT'd recently, and now we train together. And we've never really gone down that rabbit hole of going into mechanics because we've never had to. Like, he was never at a situation where it was really warranted because initially he was teaching me how to train. So when we train together now, if I'm going to try and set up a perfect, reverse banded Smith press, there's no point when we're training together because it's going to need to be set up differently for both of us. I'd feel bad putting him in a situation where it's not perfect. Okay, he's not going to get as much from this. So we tend to just base things off things being a little bit more simple. And we're lucky at Ultraflex to have, it's an absolute toy town. We've got tons of different things to play with. But if we were in a pure gym, we'd also be in the same boat. We wouldn't necessarily be going too deep into stuff because why would we? Like, in my opinion, it's far simpler just to do something that's a little bit easier. The two of us are training together, so we can essentially do that same thing ourselves. If he needs spotting through a rep, if I need spotting through a rep, we can both do it, which is going to be what a reverse band or a band is going to do. And then you're all set in place from there. So there are still certain bits where I'm like, right, I'm going to get a bit nerdy on this because we're going to get more from it. But it's not a huge part of my program. It's probably, I don't know, it is, for example, there's a session where I've got 6 or 7 movements in it. 1 or 2 of them will be a bit complicated. The rest will be a heck of a lot more simple. So we can just get in there and we can train. And then from a coaching side, it's quite similar. So it's very rare for me in someone's first phase of programming to have anything banded or reverse banded or anything like that. Because when I'm coaching, I'm like, I need to make sure this person's actually in a situation where they can lift weight normally, quote unquote normally, before I actually put them in something that's potentially going to be a bit more advanced. Like a hack squat, for example. There's no point in me setting a reverse banded hack squat if I don't know fully for sure to start whether or not they can hack in general. But if I kind of go, right, okay, we've run with this program for 16 weeks as a generic number. They've hacked for 16 weeks. Strengths come up by this amount. Okay, we're now reaching a situation where if we put a reverse band on this movement, they're going to be able to get more from it. It's going to be a slight change in stimulus. It's going to be a more challenging way of doing it. But also, I've seen them hacking for 16 weeks. I know exactly how they're going to respond to it. I built that relationship even to the point where I can tell them how to put the band on there, and then they can get a lot more from it. So it's 100% still something that I'll use when I coach, because I think it has a huge place, especially if someone gets more advanced in their training. But it's not like that automatic process of, okay, this exercise is always better with a reverse band, or this exercise always has to be set up like this. Yeah. Because it's just not the case for most people.
I like that as well.
It almost overcomplicating it.
Yeah, I also like the fact that you layer on this information. It's like giving somebody on day one who's never ever looked at their diet before macros and just go.
Yeah.
As opposed to kind of giving them a meal plan and then maybe saying like have a relatively lower carb approach and then go add a bowl of rice, right? This is almost like do a hack squat. It's a machine. It helps it easy, and then go right. Add the band. We're now getting a little bit more from this. In the same way you would go, same reason why you would do maybe a floor press into a dumbbell press. You create range of motion, you add instability, right? And I think that's something people forget in this seek of being perfect is that you don't want to necessarily have to rush this process. And I think one of the things I learned from Elliot Upton, actually, was speaking about off air, is that it's sometimes it's like people change their programs way too frequently to the point where you run out of progressions. So the training becomes a little bit boring. If you can just make small, tiny adjustments that we only need to change it when it's necessary, just enough to keep things engaging, rather than having to try and come up with a new program every month because it's an arbitrary 4 weeks. For For the coaches to this, I remember having a conversation with Johnny Jacobs when I was writing programs. He was like, man, you write a lot of programs. Why are you writing so many? I went, well, they need a new program. And he went, when you're writing programs, is it because the client's bored of it or are you bored of it? And I was like, that's such a really good point, because I've probably done a variation of GBC 8 times a day, 6 days a week, whereas that client does it once a week.
Yeah.
And
then they might be getting into it and be like, this is great, this. And you're like, no, we're going to do something else now.
Yeah, exactly. I love this program. Well, sorry, week 5, fuck you. I always goes. I think going on to sort of like the Gen Pop muscle building, before we give a couple of, I'll say closing questions and make it sound quick, but they're probably bigger than this one. But one of the things I've come to realize from a coaching perspective is working through a lot of people now that have gone through dieting coming out of it, is that I think people do not want to build muscle as much as they say they do. In reality, they have this idea in their head that they want to look like Dwayne Johnson, but in reality, they just want to have a beer and a pizza and not get fat.
Yeah.
And I think that was a big shift in my business, because it changed how I approach things. Rather than trying to go, this is how we're going to optimize the building process, I just feel like you're fighting a brick wall because they just don't want to do it and they don't want to increase the food because they're scared of getting fat. Whereas now it's like, let's set up training in the way you enjoy it. Let's keep it enjoyable so you keep coming back to the gym. Let's slowly build calories through like having a free meal with the partner on a Saturday, and you'll build a bit of muscle, but your ceiling is capped. Having worked now with beginner and more advanced clients through Pro Coach, do you see the same thing? Do you agree with that statement? And what's the differences between the two demographics?
Yes, I think the main difference is those two people can have the same goal, but they don't actually understand what that goal is necessarily when someone's brand new into it. People will sometimes, when they're fresh into training, they'll be like, oh, I put on 10 kilos of muscle, because in their head it's, oh, I go into the gym, I train for a little bit, and then it goes on. Whereas people, when they're more advanced, they fully understand that actually that's going to be a commitment for X amount of time, but I'm going to have to do these number of things well enough for that period of time for me to be able to get there. And you're absolutely right. So with that kind of more Gen Pop client, they kind of go, right, I want 10 kilos of muscle. And if you sat them down and went, right, I need you to be doing these things for 18 months. Do you think you can do that? 99% of them are going to say no. And it's not a negative thing in any sense. It's just they're not willing to do it, or they can't do it, or for every reason they're not going to. But that's when you just have to change the framework a little bit. Be like, right, okay, let's shift that goal a little bit. Not just shit on them and be like, no, you're not going to gain 10 kilos of muscle. Goodbye. But be like, okay, this is what you're willing to do. This is what you're comfortable to do. This is what's going to fit into your life. Okay, this is what we can potentially get to. And then they've got that direction in their head of being like, okay, this is what I'm going to start to push to. But then, as you said, the further you move up that scale, if someone, for example, is a competitor, and I came off a call with a guy called Ben a couple of days ago, competed this year, did phenomenally well, and we're looking at kind of the next 12 months of his competitive career, and we're kind of being like, right, we've got 5 or 6 kilos up to his weight cap. We're going to try and push that on as aggressively as we can, and he's fully on board with that because he fully understands what you need to do for that. He needs to basically see the next year of his life being like, right, I am an athlete. I need to, within that, hold myself to a certain standard for that entire time, basically be on prep, but not dieting within that, and get to that point. So I think that's where the main difference lies. It's just people, when they're a bit newer, they haven't been exposed to what they need to do to build muscle. So they don't fully understand what it actually is they sign themselves up for, if they're going to get there in the first place.
I completely agree with you. I think expectation management is one of the best skills a personal trainer can have. Letting people, like, it puts the impetus and ownership on them rather than on you to get that result, because it's like, well, this is what you're going to have to do. Like the cold hard facts. I don't care how you do it. If you want the 10,000 average steps on a diet, I don't care if you do 50,000 Saturday, Sunday, do 4 Monday through Friday, but you get there. This is one of the things, going back to shouting out Reed, is Reed does very well. I don't care how you hit 1% down per week, but you just got to hit it. Right, and if you want to eat 600 calories Monday through Friday and 14,000 on Saturday, Sunday, go for it. But the average has to be equal this. Now, I think, as much as I think that when it comes to losing fat, it's certainly important. With building muscle, do you get much bite back from your general population clients, where it's that sort of like, there's a little bit of denial here, where they either don't want to commit to that, but they still keep getting disappointed when they're not hitting those targets? Or do you get people that say, yeah, I want to hit those targets, and when they put on any body fat whatsoever, no matter how much you convince them that this has to be necessary, they all of a sudden, you look at the check-ins and your target's at 2,500 and they're averaging 21.
Yeah.
Or haven't eaten carbs today because they're
It's like self-sabotage, isn't it? Because they're like, oh, well, I like being lean, I like having abs, I've got a holiday. and I don't want to kind of do what I need to get there. Yeah, I think that's a really common thing actually, and I think also that underpins, not to kind of like generalize Gen Pop clients, but realistically, Gen Pop clients aren't going to go to an extreme because they don't need to. Like if you look at your average Gen Pop client, you kind of go, right, what are the characteristics of this person? For them going to the gym, they're not a bodybuilder. For them going to the gym is a hobby. They enjoy training, they enjoy dieting, they enjoy feeling good. But if it comes down to an order of importance, they're going to put their family first. They're going to put their friends second. They're going to put their work third, and then their own physique is probably going to come fourth. So I think, again, like you said with communication, you've got to frame things in a way where you're setting them up to get to where they want to be, but you're also not completely disregarding their own lives at the same point. And that's, again, not to undersell them and be like, oh, you're never going to achieve this point here. But it's just slightly more realistic goal setting. Like they're never going to be able to normally change things as aggressively as someone who is a bodybuilder is going to be able to, because they haven't got the luxury of that in their lives.
Is there a way you communicate with somebody like this? Because sometimes when you set the expectations with people, they all understand them, they agree with them, but then you see that every week the check-in comes in and they're 500 calories under the target. Like, how do you approach that? Because they're telling you what you want to hear, but they're not doing the actions. Like, how do you approach those situations?
Yeah, so I think it's, if someone's in that situation where they're doing that, I would go down the route of, well, what you need to do to get to where you've said you want to be. If you're not doing that, that's fine. But if you say, for example, you're 2,000 calories or 2,500 calories, you're going to hold this, but your training's not going to move as well as it could do because you're not recovering going into sessions. And almost like put it back on them, but like, what are you enjoying about training at the minute? Okay, should we set some strength targets? Okay, if you want to get towards these strength targets, you're going to need to eat for it. Because here you're going to be spinning your wheels and you're inevitably not going to get there. So it's like the way I'll coach, and you might see this from kind of how I'm answering this stuff, is it's never set on negativity. It's never, and I was like this at UP, I'd never sit down with a client and just completely berate them for doing something wrong, because that's not me as a person. I don't think that's productive for a lot of people. It's looking at it and being like, right, okay, these are what your actions are doing now. This is where you're going to get to. Are you happy with that? And if they're not, then we've got to change something about it. But suddenly then the onus is on them to change. And if they don't, then I don't mind, because they're still going to have a certain number of things going in the right direction. But if they understand that, then it tends to be okay. And it avoids that situation where they're coming to you and be like, you said I was going to do this in 6 months and I've not followed any of it, but I've not achieved it. It's your fault, which is still quite a common thing.
Yes, yeah. I approach things like exactly the same way. It's like I don't mind what you like when it's making adjustments to diet. It's like we can either decrease this much food or increase this much activity. What do you want to do? We could either do this or that. There isn't an option. There isn't a secret option 3. You pick option A or option B, right? Is this or that choices? Which I think is really important when it comes to that. But when it comes to setting targets, you mentioned 2 things here: strength targets and where you're going to get to in terms of body weight targets.
Yeah.
Most coaches listening to this now will know probably about 0.5% to 1% per week down gets you shredded. Muscle building targets are much harder because it's not all muscle. How do you approach setting targets to somebody? Let's go first body weight, and then we'll talk strength.
So for probably at least 2 years, I don't think I've set a body weight target for anyone trying to build muscle. Because for me, it's not a relevant marker to them, because what's going to happen is if you tell someone, okay, the physique that you want to get to, you've first got to get to 100 kilos. And then when you're at 100 kilos, you've got enough muscles to then diet down and show it off. The first thing they're going to do is they're going to go, perfect, right, that 100 kilos is my goal. It's time to eat. Like, it's time to get as much food as I can physically get in my face, and I'm going to get myself to that point. So I think that can be a bit of a dangerous thing to happen, because people place all their kind of like, not their gratification, but they put all their kind of weight in terms of getting to that weight. They kind of go, right, when I'm there, I'm going to be happy. But because it ends up being this fluid thing, it may not necessarily be the case. And I never want to leave someone in a situation where they're at 100 kilos. They're like, oh, I'm smaller and faster than I expected. What on earth's happened here? So because it's quite a common thing I've got a lot of dudes at the minute who are looking to build tissue. The way I'll tend to look at things in check-ins is tracking as many variables as possible and having as broad a spectrum of things we can look at as we can. Weight is going to come into it because it's a useful metric to track, but I'm going to be looking at how they feel, how the training is going, how numbers have moved up, and going pretty hard onto those in check-ins and championing a lot of that stuff in there. Right, how's food been going down? How's your hunger been? How have a couple of bits been away from the gym? And that is the stuff that we look at rather than setting necessarily a weight target. And weight is going to be coming up, but no, it's not something I tend to do a huge amount. It's almost like weight going up as a byproduct of the other things that they're doing, rather than they have to get to this point to gain this amount of muscle. And again, that fits with the same thing of enjoying that whole process side of things and building muscle without even thinking about it, rather than being like, oh, have I got bigger today? Stepping on the scales, oh, I've lost 0.2 of a kilo, have I lost muscle? Oh, shit, I'm not doing what I want to do. I'll try and eat a bit more food now. It just ends up spinning around in their heads.
Have you ever had a period of time when it comes to, I was going to ask this earlier, but when you, period of time in your journey being sort of necessarily long and not necessarily built for a lot of lifts in the same way that I am, where your limiting factor wasn't necessarily just the amount of food you had in? For example, for me, I've always had a sticking point in pressing, and it's always mid-back related. It's always a lack of stability. And that becomes a tricky thing because the numbers then just don't go up. And it's often really long-term things just to get even half a kilo onto the bar. How did you approach those situations with you or a client that's going through the same thing?
So for me first, I was exactly the same thing. I think taller, longer limbed people are always going to struggle with pressing. It's one of the hardest things to develop. So I would look at certain lifts that I was looking to progress and I was looking to build up, and I'd have them as being important, but they wouldn't be the only marker of success in that session. So say, for example, if, I don't know, I had a machine fly and 2 presses, like an incline press and a flat press, for example's sake, and maybe the incline dumbbell press was the one that I was really looking to build up, and that's the one that was going really slowly, I'd look at that and be like, right, has that gone up? If it has, fantastic. But I've also got these other 2 lifts that are going to be helping to build my chest. And if they're still going where I want them to go, contraction's getting better, numbers are moving up, quality of work done is going up in that as well, I would then look at that as not being a plateau necessarily, even though that incline dumbbell press was going really slow. So it's branching this stuff out into other areas, so it's not just focused on one specific thing. Because otherwise that'll 100% happen. Like again, that's where I get bored of it. Like if I'm adding a rep to a dumbbell press over a month, no, that gets to a situation where it's like, I feel like I'm just spinning my wheels here and I'm not going to get anything from this. And I think I tend to do a similar thing with clients as well. It's a case of if a movement's going slowly, or for example, movement regresses on a certain week, and we've championed that a little bit on the logbook, and we're like, oh, let's try and get your RDL to this weight, and they lose a rep in a particular week, and they come in a bit disheartened. They're like, oh, why has that gone behind? It's then starting to piece together, like, right, let's look at the session as a whole. Let's look at it as an entity. Have any bits actually potentially contributed towards that going down a little bit? Maybe they've got a seated leg curl before the RDL. If the seated leg curl's gone up, brilliant. That's going to affect their RDL. That's them gaining a little bit of muscle on there. Okay, and that also explains why the RDL has gone down. And almost like that problem-solving type approach, it explains them, right, okay, unless they've properly messed up on something, there's going to be a reason behind why that hasn't gone the right direction. So again, similar things, that whole coaching style, they're coming away from a check-in, or they're coming away from a session, but like, actually, I have made progress with this because I've changed how I'm looking at it at the same time.
Yeah.
So rather than seeing it as being stuck, it's like, actually, it's still moving.
Do you then at any point go into the minefield of trying to find out where the weak link is and try and solve that? Because like the more you learn about mechanics and anatomy, the more you have an ability to work out what that issue is. But I still find it's a bit of a minefield. It could be one of 7 things. And you could spend 6 months working on something that actually doesn't improve your press whatsoever.
Yeah. Again, typically no. Because it's just such a minefield. And realistically, one of the limitations of working online with people is because you're not there with them, you can't see the intricacies of every single rep. But again, I'm not so arrogant. I'd back myself if I've got someone in front of me pressing and there's something wrong with that press. In my head, I can pretty quickly work out, right, this is what we need to do. Whether it's execution, whether it is whatever it might be in that exercise, whether it's a weakness somewhere else, I back myself to be able to go, right, okay, this is what we need to do with it. But online, it's so hard to do that. Like a video setup, it's so hard to do it. You can have someone with a tripod next to them, they go through a set, and it's just hard to see. So I tend not to go too far down that route.
Can you do it for yourself?
Unless it's...
When you're in the sets yourself, could you work out what the problem is?
Normally, yes. But it wouldn't just be at the time. If, again, flat dumbbell press has really got stuck, and I've done it 3 or 4 times, it's not moving anywhere, I'm probably going to be like, right, okay, I think I can start to piece together this. Let's play about with a few different bits, and let's put that into the session and see how it goes. Maybe it's a bit of pre-activation work on something else beforehand. Okay, how does that go upwards? But I think that's also a very interesting discrepancy, because I would enjoy nerding out on that myself, because it's my body and I can feel all these different things and I can see the response. But it ends up being online a bit almost like guessing in the dark. And you kind of telling someone like, right, try this movement beforehand. Let's maybe do some mid-back work before you go into a press and see how it feels going into the press. And they go, oh, it feels the same. because they're not necessarily going to be as in tune. They're like, oh, I feel like I wasted a little bit of time here, and they're constantly
Or
trying
not
to find
do
an
it at
answer,
all.
maybe not. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and they
Because it's not the heavy stuff.
Yeah, exactly. It's not the fun bit. So again, not a massive amount. I said I would, and yeah, and as I said, in answer to your question, I think I could probably piece together what it was for me, from what I know and from my training experience on me. But no, not necessarily with an online client.
So because I appreciate you got to shoot in 10 minutes. So I've got last 3 questions. And they're just going to be quite broad, but I think that this is going to be the key takeaways on this. So let's go nutrition first. What is the biggest reason with nutrition that people do not build the muscle that they want to build?
They are going to one of 2 extremes. They're either eating too similar training, too optimally, and they're eating too clean, or they're not eating well enough. And they're either going to have a whole, like I've got a saying, David Mertzer, who I used to work with, at Mayfair. We actually started on the same day, didn't I? And he messaged me once about this. And one of the things that I'll sometimes say to people, I think I put on my Instagram before, is you should never be in a calorie surplus, but a nutrient deficit, because that's what's going to happen. If you go to that end of the extreme and you're just eating a load of rubbish, you're not in a good spot. So people tend to be at one of those 2 ends because they want an extreme somewhere. They're either going to be like, right, I can only eat potato as my carb source. I'm going to get 700 grams of carbs down purely from potato, and that's all I can eat. Or they go the other way and be like, actually, I'm going to get it purely down from chips. So it's find that balance between the 2 for depending where they're at that particular time.
Yeah.
And how I normally put...
Go on. No, go on.
Sorry, I was going to say, how I normally put that in practice with someone is find the limit of what someone can eat from the highest quality food possible, get that baseline in place, and then there's more calories that they need, you bring it in from simpler sources. So someone's dinner might be, I don't know, chicken breast, potato, again, as an example, a good amount of veg, and you kind of go, right, that is a very good quality main meal. We need 400 more calories, have a muffin. Because you've got to get the calories in from somewhere, but you've also, the whole meal isn't just a load of rubbish.
Yeah, you're putting Skittles in your oats.
Exactly. It's healthy food. I mean, do as I say, not as I do. It goes a really cool colour as well if you do that. Colour below, which looks really nice. It makes it a bit more palatable.
I remember when I did a prep coached by Cal, and it was the period of time where he was really into his sludges.
Oh yeah.
So I had my cream of rice sludge, and the only protein powder I had from the previous coach I had was a guy called Ant from Shapeshifters, and he's created generally one of the best meal replacement protein powders in the world. Unfortunately, he's not international shipping at the moment, but it's for YouTube watchers. I do have a tub of it here. This is what it is. Link in my bio if you do want a little bit of discount. But it really it literally it's vegan protein powder, greens, fiber, flax seeds. It's unbelievable. But the banoffee flavor is green. So it looked like it tastes like a banana milkshake. A little bit more earthy because it's a vegan protein powder. Never going to be amazing, but it's passable. And I mixed it in with this sludge. It was like I was having Incredible Hulk's shit for breakfast. But it was brilliant. I absolutely loved it. But I think that's a really valid point about that, about people going to 2 extremes, because we think about the potential issues with recovery and digestion by just eating poor food. But if you're trying to get 700 grams worth of potatoes, you're probably not going to ship for a week because of the amount of fiber that you have.
No, it's going to absolutely wreck you. I remember a time where I was dieting once for the same shit I did with Rob, and I was like, I'm really hungry here. I need to get some food into me. And I had 2 whole heads of broccoli. And for some reason in my head, it was a good idea to have this with some chicken for dinner. And I couldn't shit for about 3 days. I was on the gym floor and I was like, I feel absolutely god awful here. And then when it eventually got there, it was like Armageddon. And it's just, as soon as you get to that situation, you just feel horrendous. So but so people end up getting lost down that route as well. I'm like, I need to get everything possible into me, but it doesn't have to be 100% of your food.
The biggest problem I see when it comes to nutrition, to answer my own question, is I feel that when people always think they eat more than they do. I eat loads and they're not tracking it. And when you actually track the food, it's because they're eating rubbish that they assume it must be a lot of calories. But actually, they've gone 6 hours, they got distracted at work and didn't touch a thing. And I fall into that bracket if I'm not accountable to myself. What level of tracking do you have with people? Because I'm assuming you're not, I know you did, but I'm assuming that all your people in an off-season are tracking every calorie, every gram, precisely like you were in a dieting phase. So how do you keep that level of accountability to make sure they're eating enough without this, I have to control everything that I'm putting in my mouth in the same way?
So it depends how someone's nutrition is set up, first of all. There's kind of the macro crowd and there's the meal plan crowd. If someone is in a situation where they want a meal plan, they don't want to have to think about what they're doing, that tends to be quite easy because I can just set them right, eat these meals, go eat that for the day, and they're all happy. They haven't got to think about what they've got to eat. We both know that they're getting enough food down into them and everything is kind of smooth sailing from there. But then if someone is the macro route, it can be sometimes a little bit tougher because you need them to be tracking enough so they can actually understand how many calories they're taking in. But it's not necessarily a time to be as anal with things as when you're dieting. So it's finding that blend of, okay, we can track certain parts of this, but also other areas of calories can be estimated to a certain extent. And again, it depends on someone is in their journey. If someone is brand new to this stuff, they're probably going to track things a little bit more and realize what they're eating. As someone moves further up the chain, they can start to eyeball things a little bit, and I'll trust them to eyeball it a little bit. So look at a dinner and be like, right, okay, this plate is 600 calories. I've got 400 calories with it. Perfect. That hits my box for the day. Because again, it goes back to that whole thing before. If it's 18 months and they're using myfitnesspal for every single meal for every single day, they're going to burn themselves out pretty quickly. So you can't have them doing that because they're going to start to hate it, and they're going to reach that situation where they rebel against it and they don't want to. But you also need a certain amount of tracking in there. So if someone's new, they'll do a decent amount of tracking, then I'll start to ease out a little bit. As someone is more advanced, it's a bit more like, right, let's track it, but not necessarily myfitnesspal. Like tracking it in your head, making a note in your check-in sheet of what meal you've had. Perfect.
I suppose it's keeping an element of structure. So you've got a base level of calories that you're always eating and you're adding to it. Whether it's a meal plan or I know what 2,000 calories looks like and I get that as a minimum and then I add stuff on top.
Yeah, exactly. But what makes it easy though is a lot of time when people are doing this, they're going to eat the same things every day or similar meals most days. Like it's really rare for someone to have 4 very different meals every single day during the week. They're going to have like fallbacks they're going to go to. They're going to have, I tend to have this for dinner. Or they might normally have a similar lunch, but them and their husband, wife, whatever it might be, might cook dinner together. And we can go, right, let's keep a track on that one. But because your lunch is the same every single day, we haven't got to track it. We can just manipulate that if we need to. And that makes it a heck of a lot easier too. Because one of the things you find is when you're overeating for a period of time, enjoyment of food is inevitably going to come down a little bit. So you lose that desire to be like, I'm going to cook up this stir fry for dinner. It's like, I'll get a packet of rice, a packet of veg and some chicken again. But you don't really mind that because it's got a purpose.
Yeah. When it comes to training, what's the biggest mistake you feel people make with training?
Not training smartly and hard at the same time. Rob actually put a post about this the other day, and people sit in 2 camps. They'll either nail themselves in the gym and be doing themselves more harm than good sometimes, or they'll go to optimal with things and not train out at all. I think most people, if you look into a gym, you look at most people trying to build muscle, most of them could train better, and pretty much all of them could train harder. But again, they don't necessarily understand what that is going to entail for them. I look at it in kind of gyms, be like, even at Ultraflex, I'm like, I wish I could put that person through a session and just utterly obliterate them on something, because then they can understand, that's what I can push to, that's the level I can get to, and then it gives them something to chase.
Yeah, I agree with that. One of the, I'm not disagreeing with this as a principle, but one of the things that's really starting to do my head in terms of coaches are pushing it now, because Mike Israel pushes it and he is the god of hypertrophy, and to some extent he is. This is not calling out him. But reps in reserve is starting to do more harm than good.
Yeah.
Because people are now going, well, you don't train to failure. We train to like 1 to 2 reps in reserve. Okay.
Yeah.
Your 1 rep in reserve is 34 reps in reserve. If you don't train to failure for a period of time, you don't know where one off it is. And people are getting so lost in that.
Yeah. And it kind of fits in with that. How you do anything is how you do everything. If they give themselves that little bit of slack in the gym, they go, I'm keeping a rep in reserve. I don't have to push this set that hard. Potentially that's going to transfer to other bits as well. I'd rather have someone be in a situation. I saw a video on this the other day. I can't remember exactly who it was, but rather have someone in a situation where like, actually, me going to failure is forcing my body to change. Me getting everything from training is my driver for things changing my body, whether it's dieting, whether it's growing, I don't really mind. But having them in a situation like, right, this is kind of the linchpin for everything else, and then other bits fall into place from there. So yeah, 100% agree.
It's like what you were saying earlier about sometimes having more adversities actually makes you get more out of things. It's that same thing as like I quite like going all in on a diet. I don't like the word sustainable in dieting, because mentally, so if you go into it as a sustainable diet, that's often people's idea of, I want all the results and half the work. It also, what's sustainable on day one when you have pizza Fridays and drinking 3 nights a week is not what's sustainable at the end of a diet when I ask you what you want back. And I also find that, like, if you want to try and get all the stuff you feel, I'm not saying dieting should be horrible or that you shouldn't have any food you enjoy, but if you're always trying to fit these things in, there's always an element of like guilt when you go out for some drinks on a Saturday night. I'd rather just get the diet done in 8 to 16 weeks and then go out for a night out and have some beers where I have no guilt whatsoever and I can truly enjoy it because the work is done.
Yes, yeah, exactly right. So like I said, that was my year of being basically a monk for a year. Like, if I can do it in a year rather than 3, I might as well do. Because otherwise, again, the slow approach is necessarily better.
The last question I have before we go into like where people can find you, if you had your time again, if you were starting this whole bulking process again, you were mid 70 kilos, would you do anything differently?
No, not one thing, because I've got myself to a situation now where I fully understand what I need to do by getting certain things right, but getting a hell of a lot of things wrong as well. And both from myself, but also being able to coach this as well. Like I'd trust myself in most situations that someone comes towards me like, oh, I want to build muscle. I'm like, right, okay, I fully understand where you're at now. I know what is needed at that point. So no. And I think, again, because it's again, not going too deep, that's been quite a big transitional period of my life the last 3 or 4 years. Like, it's changed me as a person. Like, UP made me grow up a hell of a lot, and that was the start of it. And then the years following with obviously Muscle Mentors and now Team Pro Coach, I'm kind of like, no, like, it's none of that would ever be changed, because I wouldn't want to potentially lose parts of that. I wouldn't want to be like, oh, I changed this one thing and then something else gets altered further down the line.
Yeah, I absolutely love that answer. So for people who want to learn more about the continuing saga that is your journey, where can people find you? Where can people find Pro Coach?
Yes, so my Instagram username is Alex_Team Pro Coach. The business one is just Team Pro Coach. So you can drop me a follow on there. I'm quite good with Instagram. I'm not the best with Instagram. I'm one of these people that post occasionally, but it's still things will be on there. They can ask questions on there. They can reach out and kind of chat things through on there. So yeah, anything that people have listened to and heard like, oh, that resonates quite hard with me, just drop me a message and I can chat them through there.
Mate, it's been an absolute pleasure. It's been one of the podcasts I've enjoyed the most in a very, very long time. I've really, really enjoyed this. I've learned some things that I think it will help me in my training. So I appreciate that. So thank you very much, man.
No, dude, pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much for watching the podcast. If you're like me and like to binge watch podcast episodes, click here for our most recent episode. And if you enjoy the show and want to be updated when new videos come live, click here to subscribe to the channel.